She was forced to come on Christmas blind date, but what the he did next changed everything. Hannah Reeves had just clocked out of a 12-hour shift dispatching tow trucks through freezing sleet, and she was so tired her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper. But her phone was already buzzing with the third text that week from her sister Jenna saying, "You promised you'd stop hiding at home and actually meet this guy. He's waiting at Elm Street Cafe right now. Do not bail on me." 28 years old, working dispatch for a mid-sized towing company in Des Moines, Iowa, and Hannah had spent her entire Friday routing drivers to stranded vehicles on black ice while listening to panicked people explain their emergencies through crackling cell connections. She was still wearing the bulky navy fleece pullover with the company logo that she basically lived in during winter shifts. Hair pulled back in a ponytail that had gone flat hours ago, and she sat in her car in the employee parking lot, pressing the heels of her hands against her eye sockets, trying to convince herself she had the energy to walk into a cafe and pretend to be a functional human being on a first date. The problem with working dispatch was that Hannah spent 40 to 50 hours a week being the calm voice on the other end of someone's disaster. And by the time she got off shift, she had absolutely nothing left for her own life. No energy for small talk or getting dressed up or performing the version of herself that was charming and date appropriate. Her sister had been on her for months about how she needed to put herself out there and stop using work as an excuse to avoid connection. And Jenna had finally just set this whole thing up without asking, texted Hannah the guy's name and photo and the time and place and said, "You're going. I already told him you'd be there. Don't make me look like my sister's a flake." So here Hannah was on a Friday night in mid-December, sitting in a dark parking lot trying to summon enthusiasm she absolutely did not have. And finally, she just forced herself out of the car because the alternative was going home to her empty apartment and eating cereal over the sink, which felt too depressing even for her current state. Elm Street Cafe was one of those places that tried to do everything. Breakfast all day and paninis and craft beer and locally roasted coffee. And on a Friday night 2 weeks before Christmas, it was absolutely packed with people, all noise and conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine and holiday music playing just loud enough to be annoying. Hannah pushed through the door and immediately wanted to turn around and leave because the sheer amount of stimulation after a day of headset static and emergency calls felt like too much. But she spotted him at a booth near the back, guy in his early 30s with dark hair wearing a flannel button-down. And there was a little girl next to him coloring on a kid's menu with the kind of intense focus only small children have when they're trying to stay inside the lines. Hannah felt a flicker of surprise. Jenna had mentioned he was a single dad, but hadn't said anything about him bringing his daughter tonight. She walked over because backing out now would make her sister's disappointment unbearable. And when she got to the booth, the man looked up and smiled, not one of those big performative smiles, but something smaller and genuine. And he said, "Hannah, I'm Jake. This is my daughter, Aubrey. My sister was supposed to watch her tonight, but came down with something last minute. Hope you don't mind. Thanks for coming out anyway." His voice was even and friendly, and there was no pressure in it, and Aubrey glanced up from her coloring long enough to give a little wave before going back to turning a cartoon reindeer purple. Hannah slid into the booth across from them and immediately felt the weight of having to be on, having to engage and ask questions and be interesting, and she lasted maybe 10 seconds before the exhaustion just won completely. She rubbed the bridge of her nose with her thumb and let out this long, heavy exhale that she'd been holding in since she walked through the door. And when she looked up at Jake, she just didn't have it in her to pretend. "I'm so sorry, Jake," she said, and her voice came out rough and flat. "My sister kind of forced me into this, and I just worked a 12-hour dispatch shift, and I don't have the energy to be charming or make small talk or any of the things you're probably supposed to do on a first date. I'm completely running on empty right now." She expected him to do that thing guys do where their face closes off because she just violated some unspoken rule about being enthusiastic and available, but Jake's expression didn't change at all. He just looked at her for a second like he was actually processing what she'd said, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He raised his hand to flag down the waitress who was passing by with a tray of drinks, and when she stopped at their table, he said, Can we get 2 black coffees and the largest order of fries you have, please? And maybe some of those honey mustard packets if you got them." The waitress nodded and disappeared, and Jake turned back to Hannah, and his voice was calm and completely without judgment when he spoke. "No small talk required. You don't have to say a single word if you don't want to. Let's just sit here in the quiet for 10 minutes and see if the coffee helps." Hannah felt something in her shoulders drop that had been tensed up since she walked in, maybe since she woke up that morning, and she just stared at the stranger who'd somehow given her permission to not perform, to just exist in a space without having to manage it. Aubrey looked up from her coloring and said, "Daddy says sometimes people just need to be quiet for a minute, and that's okay." With the confidence of a 6-year-old repeating something she'd heard enough times to internalize, and then she went back to her drawing without waiting for a response. The coffee arrived in heavy ceramic mugs, and the fries came in one of those red plastic baskets lined with checkered paper, and Jake pushed the basket to the middle of the table and said, "Help yourself," and then he just drank his coffee and let the silence sit there. And it wasn't awkward exactly, more like he was making space for Hannah to just breathe without expectation. She wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat soak into her palms, and she ate a few fries because she'd forgotten to eat lunch, and her body was running on vending machine snacks and coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. And slowly the noise of the cafe faded into background, static instead of feeling like it was pressing in on all sides. After maybe 5 minutes of quiet, Jake said, "Dispatch for tow trucks?" Like he was just mildly curious, not trying to force conversation but offering an opening if she wanted it, and Hannah nodded. "Yeah, Franklin Towing. Been doing it for about 4 years now." "You spend all day listening to people's worst moments and trying to get help to them as fast as possible? It's a lot." Jake nodded and took another sip of his coffee. "I'm a city building inspector. I spend my days writing violation notices and explaining to people why their deck isn't up to code. Definitely not as intense as your job, but I get the exhaustion of dealing with the public all day." Aubrey chimed in without looking up from her coloring. "Daddy checks if buildings are safe so they don't fall down and squish people." And Jake laughed quietly. "That's a pretty good summary, actually. Yeah, I make sure buildings don't squish people." Hannah felt the corner of her mouth pull up into something close to a smile, and she ate another fry. And the tightness in her chest that had been there since her sister's first text about this date started to ease just slightly. They sat there for another 20 minutes, and the conversation drifted in this easy way that didn't require Hannah to be anything other than tired and honest. And she learned that Jake had been doing the single dad thing for 3 years since Aubrey's mom decided parenting wasn't for her and moved to Arizona. That Aubrey was in first grade and obsessed with anything involving construction or buildings, which Jake found both adorable and slightly concerning for his wallet long term. Jake learned that Hannah lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side, that her sister Jenna was her main source of social interaction outside of work, that she'd gotten into dispatching kind of by accident after dropping out of community college and needing a job with benefits, and that she was genuinely good at staying calm in crisis situations, which made her valuable, but also meant she absorbed a lot of other people's stress. Aubrey announced she was done with her picture and held it up for inspection, a drawing of what appeared to be a house with extremely incorrect proportions and a purple reindeer on the roof, and Jake examined it with the seriousness of someone reviewing actual blueprints. "The roof pitch is structurally questionable, and I'm not sure that chimney meets fire code, but the reindeer is excellent. Good job, Bug." Aubrey beamed with pride and asked if she could go look at the dessert case near the front counter, and Jake said yes, but stay where I can see you. And she skipped off with her drawing clutched in one hand. Hannah watched this interaction and felt something warm unfold in her chest. Not attraction exactly, but something like recognition, like she was seeing someone navigate their life with the same kind of practical competence she used to get through her days. "She's the one who made me come tonight, actually," Jake said, watching Aubrey press her face against the dessert case glass. "Told me I needed to stop watching documentaries alone on Friday nights and go meet someone. Apparently 6-year-olds have opinions about their parents' social lives now." Hannah laughed for real this time, an actual genuine sound that surprised her. "My sister said basically the same thing. that I was using work as an excuse to avoid having a life. So I guess we're both here under duress from the important women in our lives. Jake met her eyes and his expression was soft and a little amused. Well, if we're both being forced into this, we might as well make it not terrible. You want to get actual food or are you good with fries? They ended up ordering sandwiches and Aubrey came back with a report on every dessert option available. And by the time they'd been there an hour, Hannah realized she'd stopped feeling like she had to perform or manage the interaction. She was just sitting in a booth with someone who didn't need her to be anything other than exactly what she was, exhausted and honest, and showing up in a fleece pullover that smelled faintly like the dispatch office's industrial coffee. When they finally got up to leave, Jake walked them out to the parking lot, and the temperature had dropped enough that their breath made clouds in the air. And Aubrey was holding both their hands and swinging between them, talking about how reindeer probably couldn't really fly because of weight distribution issues she'd learned about from one of her dad's workbooks. Hannah stopped at her car and turned to face Jake, and she felt like she should say something meaningful about how this wasn't what she expected or how she was glad she came. But before she could figure out the words, he just said, I had a good time, no pressure on doing this again, but if you want to grab coffee sometime when you're not running on fumes, I'd like that. His tone was easy, no desperation or expectation, just a genuine offer. And Hannah felt her whole body relax in a way it hadn't in months. Yeah, I'd like that too. Thanks for letting me just be a disaster tonight and not making it weird. Jake smiled. You weren't a disaster. You were honest. That's actually pretty refreshing. Hannah drove home and her apartment didn't feel quite as empty as it usually did. And when Jenna texted asking how it went, Hannah sent back, actually good. He let me just sit there and breathe for 10 minutes before we even talked. And Jenna responded with about 15 exclamation points and a demand for details. Hannah set her phone down and made actual dinner instead of cereal, and she realized that for the first time in a long time, she'd let someone see her completely depleted, and they hadn't treated her like a problem to fix or a mood to manage. They just sat with her in the quiet and made the noise feel a little less overwhelming, and maybe that was worth showing up for. What started as coffee when Hannah wasn't running on fumes turned into a routine. Neither of them had exactly planned, but both of them kept showing up for. And by mid-January, they'd figured out how to make dating work around her completely unpredictable dispatch schedule and his fixed inspection routes. Jake would text her around lunch asking if she was working late, and if she said yes, he'd show up at the dispatch office around 9 with takeout from whatever place was still open. Chinese or pizza or sometimes just good coffee and gas station sandwiches. And they'd eat in his truck in the parking lot while Hannah decompressed from 8 hours of routing emergency calls. If she had a rare evening off, they'd meet at the cafe, or sometimes just at her apartment where they'd watch whatever was on TV while Aubrey did homework at her small dining table. And it was the kind of low-key dating that didn't require Hannah to be anything other than herself, tired and honest and showing up in sweatpants half the time. February hit with that specific brand of Midwest cold that makes your face hurt and your car refuse to start. And Hannah's one-bedroom apartment had radiators that were original to the building, which meant they were approximately 70 years old and worked when they felt like it. She woke up one Saturday morning to find her breath visible in the air and the radiator in her main room making a hissing sound, but producing exactly zero heat. And she spent an hour on the phone with her landlord who said he'd send someone Monday, maybe Tuesday, depending on his maintenance guy's schedule. She texted Jake mostly just to complain about it, not expecting anything, just venting the way you do with people you've started to trust, and his response came back in under a minute. I'm dropping Aubrey at my sister's for a play date at 11. I can swing by after. Radiators are usually just air in the lines or a stuck valve. Probably fixable. He showed up at noon in his work boots and a canvas jacket that had seen better days, carrying a toolbox that actually had organized compartments instead of being a random collection of screwdrivers. And Hannah let him in feeling weird about it because she wasn't used to people just showing up to fix her problems without her having to ask 17 times or offer payment or make it into a whole negotiation. Jake walked straight to the radiator and knelt down examining the valve. And he didn't make a big deal about it or wait for her to thank him, just started bleeding the air out of the system using a flathead screwdriver and a coffee mug to catch the water. Your landlord's an idiot if he thinks this needs a professional. It's literally a 5-minute fix, Jake said, adjusting the valve until the hissing stopped and the radiator started making the ticking sound that meant it was actually heating. You've got some sediment buildup in here, though. You should make him flush the system before next winter, or you're going to have the same problem. Hannah stood there watching him work and feeling this complicated mix of gratitude and discomfort, because accepting help had always felt like admitting she couldn't handle her own life. But Jake wasn't treating this like he was rescuing her. He was just fixing a radiator the way you'd help a friend move furniture or jump their car battery, practical and matter of fact. When he finished, he washed his hands in her kitchen sink and said, "You got anything to eat, or should we order something?" And they ended up getting Thai delivery and eating it on her couch while some home renovation show played in the background. And it felt easy in a way Hannah hadn't experienced before, like she could just exist next to someone without having to perform or entertain or manage the interaction. By March, they'd settled into this rhythm where Jake was just part of her life in this quiet, integrated way. He'd pick her up from late shifts when her car was acting up. She'd help Aubrey practice her spelling words when Jake was stuck on a job site running late. And it was the kind of partnership where neither person was carrying all the weight and neither person was keeping score. Hannah met Jake's sister briefly when she dropped Aubrey off one Sunday, got the very thorough older sister evaluation that came with pointed questions about her intentions and her job stability, and apparently she passed because Jake texted her later that night saying, "Claire likes you. She said you seem normal," which is high praise from her. Hannah's sister Jenna met Jake when he came to pick Hannah up from a family dinner, and Jenna pulled Hannah aside in the kitchen and said, "He's solid, like genuinely stable and employed and good with his kid. Don't screw this up by overthinking it," which was rich coming from someone who'd never maintained a relationship longer than 4 months. But Hannah appreciated the sentiment. Spring came late and wet, and Hannah's dispatch shifts got busier with the usual rotation of people driving too fast on slick roads and calling in panic when they ended up in ditches. And she pulled 3 doubles in one week, covering for a coworker whose kid had the flu. Jake brought her dinner on the second double, showed up at the dispatch office at 10 p.m. with burgers and actual vegetables because he said she couldn't live on vending machine snacks, and he sat with her during her break in the empty break room while she ate and half listened to the radio chatter from the other room. "You look exhausted," he said, not as criticism, just as observation, and Hannah nodded because there was no point denying it. "Yeah, this week's been brutal. I've got one more overnight Thursday, and then I'm off for 3 days. I'm going to sleep for approximately 16 hours straight." Jake reached across the table and squeezed her hand once. "Text me when you get home safe Thursday night. Doesn't matter what time. I just want to know you made it." Something about that simple request, the idea that someone was keeping track of whether she got home okay, made Hannah's throat feel tight, and she squeezed back and said, "Yeah, I will." And she meant it. They were good together in this practical blue-collar way, where they both understood that sometimes work came first and plans changed, and that was just how life worked when you weren't wealthy enough to have flexible schedules. Aubrey seemed to have accepted Hannah as a fixture in their lives, would ask her opinion on important matters like whether purple or green was a better color for dinosaurs, and if buildings could theoretically be built on the moon. And Hannah found herself genuinely enjoying these conversations in a way that surprised her because she'd never thought much about kids before. December rolled around again, and with it came the usual pre-Christmas chaos. Everyone trying to cram errands and travel into a few weeks, and the weather deciding to be as uncooperative as possible. The ice storm hit on December 20th, started as freezing rain Tuesday afternoon and just kept coming. And by Wednesday morning, Des Moines was a skating rink, and Hannah's dispatch board lit up like a Christmas tree with calls. She worked a 16-hour shift Wednesday covering for 2 other dispatchers who couldn't make it in, slept on the cot in the break room for 4 hours until the morning dispatcher finally made it in Thursday at 6 a.m., then headed home to crash for a few hours before coming back for another evening shift. By Thursday evening, she'd worked 3 back-to-back extended shifts in the same week, living on coffee and whatever food people brought in. And her phone had about 15 texts from Jake that she'd barely had time to respond to. Thursday evening around 7, her phone buzzed again, and it was Jake asking if she needed anything, offering to bring her dinner or clean laundry or just come sit with her during a break. And Hannah stared at the message, feeling this immediate tightness in her chest that she recognized as the old familiar panic about depending on someone. She'd spent years building her life so she didn't need anyone, so she could handle her own emergencies and her own problems without having to ask for help or owe anyone anything. And the idea of Jake showing up to take care of her when she was barely functional felt like crossing a line she wasn't ready to cross. Something in Hannah immediately tightened at the idea of needing help again, of depending on someone when she'd spent years teaching herself not to, and her fingers were typing before her brain had fully caught up to what she was saying. Please don't come, Jake. I can't do this right now. I don't have the energy to lean on someone or have someone leaning on me. I just need to get through this week alone. She hit send and immediately felt sick about it, but also relieved in that terrible way where, you're self-sabotaging, but at least you're in control of it. The message showed as read almost immediately, and then Jake's typing indicator appeared and disappeared, appeared again and disappeared again, and then nothing. No response, just silence. Hannah set her phone face down on the desk and went back to routing trucks, and she told herself this was fine. She was protecting herself. She didn't need anyone else's help to get through a hard week. She'd been doing this job for 4 years and she knew how to handle it. What Hannah didn't know was that Jake was standing in his kitchen reading her text for the third time, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong, or if this was just Hannah's default setting when things got overwhelming. And his first instinct was to respect what she'd said and back off because she'd been clear about needing space. But he'd also spent the last 10 months learning how to read what Hannah needed versus what she said she needed. And that text wasn't saying, leave me alone forever. It was saying, I'm terrified of being vulnerable, and I don't know how to let people in when I'm struggling. He read it one more time, then put his phone in his pocket and walked over to where Aubrey was building something elaborate with wooden blocks on the living room floor. Bug, I need to go help Miss Hannah with something. You're going to stay with Aunt Claire tonight, okay? Go grab your overnight bag. Aubrey looked up from her blocks with the suspicious expression of a 6-year-old who knew when adults were being weird. Is Miss Hannah okay? And Jake crouched down to her level. She's just really tired from work, and sometimes when people are that tired, they forget it's okay to let other people help. So I'm going to go remind her. Aubrey nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood this concept from personal experience. Like when I said I didn't need help with my shoes, but they were on the wrong feet. Jake smiled despite everything. Yeah, Bug, exactly like that. Now go get your stuff. He dropped Aubrey at his sister's place and ignored Claire's knowing look when he said he had to go deal with something. And then he sat in his truck in her driveway for a few minutes, trying to decide if showing up when Hannah specifically said not to was crossing a line, or if sometimes you had to push through someone's walls when you knew they were hurting. He thought about the first night they met when she'd been so exhausted she couldn't pretend to be okay, and how the best thing he'd done was just give her space to be exactly that. And he thought about the last 10 months of watching her slowly learn to let him in and how hard that had clearly been for her. He started the truck and pulled out onto the icy roads, and he made a decision that Hannah might hate him for, but he was going to do it anyway, because sometimes love looks like respecting boundaries, and sometimes it looks like showing up when someone says they don't need you, but you know they're drowning. Thursday night hit like the final round of a fight Hannah had been losing all week, and when she finally clocked out at 9 p.m. on December 20th, after 6 straight days of extended shifts, she felt like her entire body was held together with coffee and spite and not much else. The dispatch office was finally quiet. The ice storm had passed and the backlog of stranded drivers had cleared, and her supervisor had sent her home with orders not to come back until the 27th, because she'd logged more overtime in 1 week than most people did in a month. Hannah grabbed her coat from the break room and walked out to the employee parking lot into air, so cold it hurt to breathe. And she was so focused on just getting to her car and going home to sleep for 15 hours that she didn't notice anything wrong until she turned the key in the ignition and got absolutely nothing. Not even the clicking sound of a struggling battery, just complete dead silence. She tried it 3 more times because maybe the universe was just messing with her and the 4th turn would magically work, but her car battery was thoroughly dead. She'd noticed it cranking slowly the last few days but had been too busy to deal with it. And now in the sub-zero cold, it had finally given up completely. The supreme irony of being a tow dispatcher stranded in an empty parking lot was not lost on her. Hannah sat there in the driver's seat with her forehead pressed against the steering wheel trying to figure out her options, and the logical move was to call one of her own drivers for a jump or a tow. But the idea of doing that after she'd just spent 6 days running them into the ground felt impossible. They deserved to be home with their families, not rescuing their dispatcher, who should have known better than to let her battery die. She pulled out her phone and stared at Jake's name in her contacts, thumb hovering over it. But the last message in their thread was still her telling him to leave her alone. And she hadn't heard from him since Thursday night, which was either him respecting her boundaries or him being done with her, pushing him away. And she didn't have the emotional capacity to find out which. Hannah locked her phone and shoved it in her pocket and grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, and she started walking toward the main road to flag down a cab, bundling her coat tight against the wind and telling herself she could handle this without calling Jake after spending a week proving she could handle everything alone. She made it about 2 blocks before the wind cut through her coat like it wasn't even there, and her fingers went numb even inside her gloves. And she admitted to herself that standing on a corner in sub-zero wind chill waiting for a cab that might not even be running this late was a bad plan. The only place she could see with lights still on was Elm Street Cafe about a block ahead. Hannah pushed through the door into warmth and the smell of coffee and pine from the small Christmas trees someone had set up near the register, and the place was nearly empty, just one couple in the corner and a guy reading a newspaper at the counter, and she slid onto a stool at the far end and ordered tea she didn't really want, just so she could sit somewhere warm and figure out her next move. The waitress brought her Earl Grey in a chipped mug, and Hannah wrapped both hands around it, and she pulled out her phone and started looking up the number for a cab company, even though she wasn't sure any were running this late, and she was so focused on the screen, she didn't hear the door open behind her. The bells above the entrance chimed and cold air rushed in, and Hannah glanced up at the mirror behind the counter, more out of habit than interest, and her breath caught completely when she saw Jake walking in, wearing his heavy canvas work jacket with ice crystals melting in his hair. He wasn't holding flowers or some grand romantic gesture. He had a set of jumper cables slung over his shoulder and a metal thermos in his hand. And when his eyes found her sitting at the counter, his expression did this complicated thing where relief and concern fought for dominance. He walked over and set the cables down on the counter next to her with a solid thunk that made the waitress look over curiously, and Hannah felt her whole body go rigid, pride and exhaustion and guilt all slamming into her at once. She looked down at her tea instead of at him, gripping the mug hard enough that her knuckles went white. "I told you I needed to handle my own mess," she said, and her voice came out rough and thick like she was fighting tears she absolutely did not have permission to cry right now. "You didn't need to come. I was figuring it out." Jake pulled out the stool next to her and sat down slowly, and he unscrewed the top of the thermos and poured something that smelled like actual good coffee into the lid cup, not the burnt garbage the cafe was serving, and he set it on the counter between them. "Your car's dead, I'm guessing," Jake said, and his voice was calm and even. No accusation in it, just stating facts. "I called your sister Jenna when I didn't hear from you. She called Franklin and got them to check if your car was still in the lot. It was, but you'd left on foot about 20 minutes ago, so I started driving the route toward your apartment and saw you through the window here. And I'm guessing you're too proud to call one of your drivers because you've been running them nonstop all week, and you don't want to pull them away from their families on Christmas Eve. So you probably walked here in negative 15-degree weather, trying to figure out a plan that doesn't involve asking anyone for help." Hannah's jaw was clenched so tight it hurt, and she could feel tears burning behind her eyes because he just laid out her exact thought process, and she hated how well he knew her. Hated that she was this predictable in her self-sufficiency. "I can call a cab. I don't need you to rescue me," Hannah said, but even she could hear how hollow it sounded. And Jake turned on his stool to face her directly, and when he spoke, his voice dropped lower, more serious. The tone he probably used when he was explaining critical safety violations that couldn't be ignored. "Hannah, you spend your entire life dispatching help for everyone else in this city. You're the calm voice people hear when they're stranded and scared and don't know what to do. You route trucks and coordinate drivers, and make sure nobody stuck out in the cold alone. He gestured to the jumper cables sitting on the counter between them. I'm not trying to rescue you or fix your whole life or make you dependent on me. I'm just trying to dispatch some help for you the way you do for literally everyone else every single day. Hannah felt something crack in her chest. That wall she'd been maintaining so carefully for years, the one that said needing people was weakness and asking for help meant you'd failed, and she pressed her lips together, trying to hold it back, but her voice came out shaky anyway. I texted you to leave me alone, and you just ignored that. You just showed up anyway. Why would you do that when I told you I couldn't handle this? Jake's expression softened, and he reached over and gently took the tea mug out of her hands before she shattered it, set it on the counter, and then took both her hands in his, and they were freezing despite the cafe's warmth. Because I know the difference between what you say when you're scared and what you actually need, and what you needed wasn't to be left alone. You needed someone to see through the tough act and show up anyway. The tears came for real then, and Hannah let out this shaky breath that turned into something close to a sob, and she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Jake's shoulder, finally letting the wall come down completely. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders and just held her there at the cafe counter while she fell apart quietly. And he didn't tell her it was okay, or that she needed to be stronger, or that she should have asked for help sooner. He just let her be exactly what she was, exhausted and overwhelmed, and finally willing to admit she couldn't carry everything alone. After a few minutes, Hannah pulled back and wiped her face with the heel of her hand, and Jake pulled an actual clean handkerchief out of his jacket pocket and handed it to her, and she laughed wetly, because who carries handkerchiefs anymore? Come on, let's go jump your car and get you home, Jake said, standing up and shouldering the cables again, and he left a $10 bill on the counter for her tea, even though it had cost maybe $3. They walked out into the freezing night and drove back to the dispatch office in Jake's truck with the heat blasting, and he parked next to her dead car and popped his hood without ceremony. It took maybe 8 minutes to get her car started, jumper cables doing their job while they both stood in the cold, watching the connections. And when her engine finally turned over, Jake disconnected everything and closed both hoods. You're gonna need a new battery. This one's done. I'll follow you home, and we can deal with it tomorrow. AutoZone opens at 8. Hannah drove home with Jake's headlights steady in her rearview mirror. And when they got to her apartment building, he walked her to her door and said, get some sleep, actual sleep. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon with a new battery, and we'll get your car sorted. Hannah stood in her doorway and looked at this man who'd ignored her, pushing him away, because he knew her well enough to see through it. And her voice came out small and honest. I'm sorry I told you to leave me alone. I'm sorry I'm so bad at letting people help. Jake squeezed her shoulder once. You're not bad at it. You're just learning. And that's okay. I'm not going anywhere, Hannah. You don't have to do everything solo anymore. 1 year later, Christmas Eve looked completely different. Jake had moved in with her that fall after Aubrey started second grade. Her one bedroom had become a very cozy squeeze with creative use of the dining nook as Aubrey's sleep space when she stayed over. And Hannah's living room was pleasantly chaotic with wrapping paper scattered across the floor and a slightly crooked tree in the corner that Aubrey had insisted on decorating entirely by herself, resulting in all the ornaments clustered on the bottom 3 feet. Aubrey was currently building an elaborate fort out of the empty shipping boxes from presents, and she had very specific architectural opinions about load-bearing walls that she was explaining to nobody in particular. Jake was attempting to hang a string of lights across the window, but they were hopelessly tangled, and he kept muttering about how he inspected buildings for a living and couldn't manage basic Christmas decorations. And Hannah was sitting on the couch with actual good coffee watching this scene unfold with something close to contentment. She'd worked dispatch that morning but got off at 3 because she'd learned to set boundaries about holiday scheduling. And when she'd gotten home, Jake and Aubrey were already there with groceries for dinner and a plan to make the apartment look festive. Her car had a new battery that Jake had installed last January, and she'd gotten better at texting him when shifts were brutal instead of trying to white-knuckle through alone. And he'd gotten better at knowing when she needed him to show up and when she just needed space to decompress. They weren't perfect, and she still struggled with asking for help sometimes, But she was learning that letting someone carry part of the weight didn't make her weak. It just made the load lighter. And maybe that's what the right kind of love really is. Not someone who storms into your life trying to rescue you from yourself, just someone who notices you're running on empty and sits beside you in the silence until you're ready to talk. Someone who shows up with jumper cables when you're stranded because they know the difference between respecting boundaries and abandoning someone who's drowning. Hannah had spent her entire adult life dispatching help for everyone else's emergencies, being the calm, steady voice that got people through their worst moments. And she'd convinced herself that needing that same help made her a hypocrite or a failure. But Jake taught her that strength isn't carrying everything alone until you collapse. It's knowing when to let someone stand next to you and share the heavy lifting. And by the next Christmas, Hannah realized nothing in her life had magically become easier. Her job was still exhausting, and her hours were still unpredictable, and some weeks were still brutal. She was just no longer facing it alone, and that made all the difference.